if you follow international news. I mean, it can feel completely overwhelming, can it? All these conflicts, especially the ones tangled up in, deep history, social, political, religious stuff, you feel like you're just swimming in headlines, but never really getting a handle on what's actually driving the crisis.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost. Our goal today, though, is to sort of cut through that noise. We've been digging into some really detailed source material on a tough but important topic: Nigeria's religious violence, causes and protections.
Right. And the mission here is to pull out the specific insights from that research, give you a framework, really, to understand the forces at play without getting bogged down.
Exactly. And it's worth saying the sources we looked at, they're not aiming for sensationalism, not at all. They're designed as educational tools, a deep dive into the background, political, social, religious, trying to decode the structure of the conflict.
So we can move beyond just, well, generalized fear or confusion.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the core question, the one that sort of anchors all this research, it's stark, but it's necessary. It asks, who protects the persecuted?
Okay. Who protects the persecuted? That's quite a question. So let's unpack this. What's the first big takeaway the research offers?
Well, the critical starting point that the sources hammer home is that the conflict in Nigeria isn't just one thing. It's not monolithic. If you try to frame it simply as, say, a religious clash or just a political struggle, you're going to miss the mark completely.
So avoiding simplification.
Yeah.
Got it. It's driven by multiple factors.
Yes, exactly. The sources insist we need to see it through the lens of three intertwined pillars.
3 pillars. Okay, what are they?
Those are the political background, the social background, and of course the religious background. But, just naming them isn't enough. The real insight comes from seeing how they specifically play out in Nigeria.
Right. So how do they play out? Let's take the political dimension first. What do the sources highlight there?
Okay, politically. The research points straight away to things like disputes over resource allocation. Think oil revenue distribution, that's a big one. And also how political figures sometimes, weaponize religious identity for their own ends.
Weaponize identity. How so?
A key example given is the uneven application or politicization of Sharia law, particularly how it's handled in some northern states compared to the rest of the country. That's highlighted as a major accelerant for conflict.
I see. So you might hear a religious grievance being voiced loudly.
But the power behind that grievance, what's amplifying it, could actually be a political failure, maybe about sharing resources fairly.
And that links into the social side, too, I imagine.
Correctly. Yeah, absolutely. The sources really connect those dots. When you look at the social pillar, what comes up again and again?
Let me guess. Land resources.
Spot on. Conflict over land and, crucially, diminishing resources. The sources put a lot of emphasis on climate change impacts, particularly desertification, pushing southwards from the north.
Right, I've read about that. How does that fuel the violence specifically?
Well, it forces groups who rely on pastoralism, like many Fulani communities, to change their traditional grazing routes. They have to move south. And that brings them into direct, often violent contact with farming communities who are predominantly Christian in many of those areas. The farmers see them as intruders competing for scarce land and water.
So you've got climate change acting as a kind of pressure cooker.
Exactly. A social driver creating resource scarcity. And that scarcity then becomes the tinderbox for existing religious and ethnic tensions to just flare up into terrible violence.
Okay, that interconnectedness is becoming clear. Politics, resources, climate, identity.
And that's the crucial point the research makes. If your solution is only, say, military, a purely political or security response, you're ignoring the climate driver, the social driver. The conflict will just keep simmering. You have to address all three dimensions, kind of stabilize the whole system.
That makes sense. So understanding those root causes, the political failures, the social stresses from climate change, the deep religious divides that lets us move on to the specifics, right? Like the actual groups involved. Because the sources say not all violence comes from the same place or for the same reasons.
Precisely. That shift from the broad why to specific who and how is key. Once you grasp the foundations, you can better analyze the actors the sources discuss.
So where are the main actors highlighted in the research? I assume Boko Haram comes up prominently.
Oh, absolutely. Significant analysis is dedicated to Boko Haram. The sources are clear. They define them as an ideological insurgency, their main goal. The violent overthrow of Nigeria's secular government and establishing their own caliphate.
Yeah, their operations are mostly in one area.
Primarily the Northeast, yes. Focusing on, spectacular terror acts, trying to hold territory. Their violence is deeply tied into those political and religious pillars we talked about. They use a very specific interpretation of Islamic doctrine to challenge the state's legitimacy. Understanding their structure, their ideology, it's critical for that region.
Okay, so Boko Haram, ideological insurgency, Northeast focus. But the analysis doesn't stop there, does it? This is where things often get muddled in news reports.
Exactly right. And the sources are careful to draw distinctions. They give equal weight to the role of what are termed Fulani militants.
And their drivers are different. We touched on the land scarcity aspect.
Yes, that's the crucial difference highlighted. Unlike Boko Haram's goal of state replacement, the violence involving Fulani militants often starts as resource conflict, disputes over grazing rights, water access. But, and this is key, the sources show how quickly these clashes take on sharp religious and ethnic dimensions, especially if the victims are disproportionately from one faith group.
So it morphs. Starts as resource-driven, then gets framed as religious or ethnic.
It often metastasizes that way, yes, into large-scale intercommunal violence. So you have to see the distinct contexts. One, an ideological insurgency in the Northeast. The other, primarily resource-driven conflict, mainly across the Middle Belt, that gets dangerously entangled with identity politics.
That distinction feels really important for understanding what's happening.
Yeah.
And this difference in motive, this structure. It must tie into the government's role, right? You mentioned the protection question earlier.
Straight back to it, yes. The government response, or sometimes the perceived lack of response, is a critical factor scrutinized heavily in the sources. How the Nigerian state reacts to groups like Boko Haram versus how it reacts to the Fulani militant-related violence that's constantly under the microscope.
And what do the sources indicate about that response?
Well, they suggest it's often plagued by issues. Perceptions of institutional corruption, for one. The military being stretched too thin is another factor. And sometimes accusations of outright bias, especially in how resource conflicts in the Middle Belt are handled.
Which brings us right back to that core question.
Who protects the persecuted? It becomes incredibly sharp right there. If the state is seen as unable, or maybe unwilling, to provide effective neutral security for everyone, well, that whole framework of protection starts to wobble, or even collapse.
Okay, so we've got the three root causes: political, social, religious. We've identified two major but distinct actor groups, Boko Haram and Fulani militants. And we've seen how the government response, or lack thereof, is central. Now, let's pivot back fully to that theme of protection. The sources, you said, look beyond just the security angle.
They absolutely do. They make it clear that finding answers requires synthesizing different viewpoints. You can't just rely on one narrative, especially if the state response is struggling. The burden of protection then shifts, or at least needs to be shared.
So where does that protection come from, according to the research? Who else is involved?
The sources deliberately sought out a balance. They detail input from three distinct groups, each offering a necessary perspective on what protection and peace actually mean on the ground. And sometimes these perspectives are, well, quite different, even conflicting.
Interesting. Okay, who are the three groups?
First, you have the security experts, your military, your police. Their focus is, understandably, operational and tactical. They're thinking about immediate stabilization, intelligence gathering, boots on the ground to secure vulnerable areas, stop the bleeding, basically.
Right, the immediate physical security aspect.
Exactly. Then second, you have the clergy. Religious leaders from both Christian and Muslim communities, their insights often center on deeper issues: reconciliation, spiritual resilience, addressing the religious grievances that might be fueling the conflict. They tend to operate on a longer timeline, focused on rebuilding community trust.
Okay, so security is immediate, clergy is longer term, trust-focused. Is there friction there?
That's where the sources point out a potential tension, yeah. The security experts might want quick results, maybe using tactics that feel heavy-handed to the community. But the clergy, and also the third group, might argue that those short-term tactics can actually undermine the slow, difficult work of reconciliation needed for real, lasting protection.
And the third group is?
The peace advocates. These are the people working at the grassroots level. Community mediation, building bridges between groups, trying to tackle the underlying social and economic drivers, poverty, lack of opportunity that let violence take root in the first place.
So they're looking at it almost like a development problem, not just security.
Precisely. They see conflict resolution tied intrinsically to development, to addressing those social and political failures we talked about earlier.
So security for immediate safety, clergy for spiritual healing and trust, advocates for systemic change.
And the research really insists that you need all three. By weaving together these viewpoints, immediate stabilization, spiritual reconciliation, and systemic correction, you get that multi-layered approach. True protection, the sources imply, has to happen on all those fronts simultaneously: military, spiritual, social, economic.
Wow, okay. That really paints a complex picture. So pulling it all together, what are the main things you, the listener, should take away from this deep dive?
I think the absolute key is to reject any simple single-cause explanation. You have to view this crisis through that combined lens. Political, social, religious drivers all tangled together. And remember the specifics, things like desertification impacting land use or disputes over oil revenue. They're not just details, they're evidence of these drivers in action.
And definitely remembering the distinction between the actors involved.
Crucial. Understanding the difference between Boko Haram's ideological war and the resource-driven, communally charged violence involving Fulani militants is essential. They require different responses.
And finally, that critical eye on the government response.
Yes, constantly evaluating its effectiveness, its neutrality, its capacity, because that's central to determining who actually receives protection.
So if we leave our listeners with one final thought to mull over, building on that central question, what would it be?
I think it comes back to what true protection really means in a situation this complex. The sources reveal it's not just about soldiers and police checkpoints, important as they might be. It's also a negotiation, isn't it? Between these very different needs and perspectives: immediate security versus long-term healing versus systemic change.
So the final question might be,
When the causes are simultaneously political, social, and religious, where is the most effective investment for protection? Is it purely in the visible, immediate security measures? Or is it equally, perhaps even more so, in that slower, often unseen work? Things like climate adaptation projects, mediating resource disputes locally, supporting the reconciliation efforts led by clergy and peace advocates on the ground.
a challenging question with no easy answer.
Definitely not. But the sources strongly suggest that until those different forms of protection, the immediate and the long term, the top-down and the bottom-up, truly intersect and reinforce each other, lasting peace is likely to remain elusive.